Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Nate Smith, and I'm so excited to present for you today. And we're talk a little bit about LGBTQI youth and kind of the ethical implications of providing practice for them and everything, and what that all entails. And so I'm really excited to come and work with you. I understand you're looking at this from the perspective of integrated health, and I'm very I'm a big fan of integrated health, particularly when counselors can get involved with that. So the title of the presentation is called "Walking the Tightrope: Anti-LGBTQIA Youth Legislation and Ethical Counseling Implications for Practice." And we will talk about kind of a multitude of integrated healthcare, kind of allied professions and everything. But understand, my training comes from the counseling perspective, and so while I really do believe that a lot of the things that we talk about, even though they're from the counseling perspective, they can definitely be kind of universal and applied across a wide variety of experiences. And I've done a similar talks like this for folks in different healthcare professions, and we tend to see very similar situations, but I'm pulling myself from the counseling profession. But a little bit about who I am. Since I can't be with you live, I always like to do a little bio of who I am and what I bring to the presentation and our time together today. And again, my name is Dr. Nate Smith. I think of myself as a writer. I'm a licensed professional counselor supervisor in Houston, Texas. I'm currently serving as an assistant professor at St. Bonaventure University, which is based out of Olean, New York, even though I am Houston-based, and much of my work is done online. And my scholarly work and my research looks at using storytelling and narrative research modalities to get at the experiences of queer and transgender people. And I think of myself as a relational cultural therapist, which for those, I'm happy to talk about that another time, and I can talk about it at length. But really, I'm really interested in how we develop relationships and the stories that emerge as a result of those relationships. Again, I'm Houston-based. I've been practicing and teaching for about 10 years and in various capacities. I've worked in an integrated healthcare role several years ago, and have worked in university counseling settings. Have worked with private practice, and what else? I mean, in a school setting. I mean, I've been lucky to have a kind of a wide variety of experiences as a clinical mental health professional. And so, and now, of course, now I'm working in an education capacity and a researcher capacity. But, and then I do frequently present on LGBTQIA issues in counseling and mental health. And so I'm bringing kind of a pretty broad view to you in our conversation today. And then, of course, there's a photo of me. I need to update my headshots. I was looking at just kind of a photo to keep, and I thought, geez, this is one I took at a recent conference. But otherwise, the other photos don't feature my beard, which I'm very proud of, by the way. So why are we here? Well, again, while my assumption is that you are interested in helping and serving LGBTQIA youth, this conversation is a little more specific than you might have seen in more general conversations on like how to do that. And really, the main reason we're here is because we're seeing a lot of things like this pop up in the news. And these are just kind of two headlines I found as I was scrolling Facebook or scrolling social media. And my sense is you likely have seen other headlines like this in your own social media feeds. And for instance, here we see families fear a ban on gender affirming care in the wake of of the harassment of clinics. Another one here says a third of trans youth are at risk of losing gender affirming care. And these are headlines coming from NPR, and I believe one of them is from MSNBC. So the reason we're together in talking about this in an integrated healthcare perspective is because particularly as we get into understanding how to provide gender affirming care for trans and gender expansive youth, you'll find that there has to be a holistic perspective or an integrated care view of working with that community, and it's it's in jeopardy based on some of current legislation. So I want to give you a bit of a disclaimer before we jump in. I am in no way an attorney. I am in no way a politician. I am a counselor educator and a therapist. and all the other roles that I showed you earlier. And so what I share with you today really just comes from an examination of this from that lens, and these kind of legislative issues and the ways that they might impact the counseling profession, behavioral health profession, and then how it is definitely impacting primary care and the ability to provide gender-affirming care across a multitude of allied healthcare professions. And so, again, what we talk about, I'm going to assume that there's already some kinds of information and knowledge on board, when it comes to gender affirming care. And that's because this is a little bit beyond just kind of gender affirming care 101. But I still think that even if you don't have that experience or a deep knowledge base in that area, that you can still benefit from knowing what's going on in these conversations, because the reality of it is that queer and transgender youth pursue counseling at higher rates than heterosexual cisgender people, being heterosexual cisgender being non-transgender identified people. So you are going to likely encounter these issues in some form or fashion in your behavioral health practice and in your integrated healthcare work. So I want to put that up. So kind of what are the learning objectives? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about of course, we're going to review some anti-LGBTQI legislation and its impact, how it's impacting behavioral health practice with LGBTQI youth, and then also kind of the role that it's how it's impacting primary care. And I won't get super into it because, again, I'm going to speak from my lens on the behavioral health care side. But I will talk about how it's going to impact primary care, and more specifically, how it's impacting our ability to work in conjunction with primary care as behavioral health practitioners. And so we're going to look at that. Understand that what I offer you today will change. The legislative kind of atmosphere changes dramatically and very fast. So I prepared this, a couple of days ago, and it's probably already out of date on some level. So because it changes so rapidly, I'm going to just kind of talk about the big picture items, and we won't get into the specific bills or the specific proposed legislation. There are some pieces that we'll talk about that have been passed and that are currently law in certain states, just so you have a frame of reference, because a lot of those bills are going to, you're seeing proposed legislation in other states that mimic already established law in another state, but we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about the ethical implications of anti-LGBTQI legislation, particularly in behavioral healthcare practice, because as the politicians are hammering out the agendas and all of these other things, they're not always thinking about behavioral healthcare practitioners. A lot of these conversations are being had with other things in mind, but they do impact our ability to practice and really our ability to network and work in conjunction with primary care. So we really need to have a sense of what that looks like. And then finally, we'll review ethical decision-making models. And I know if you're currently in a counseling program, or even if you're in any kind of other behavioral health care graduate program, you are rolling your eyes. You're going, I already did that. I did that in ethics class. I don't need to revisit it. But I think it's really helpful. And even if you're a working professional, it's always helpful to review ethical decision-making models, because when you start to unravel what the ethical kind of dilemmas that arise as a result of this legislation and laws, you're going to be really thankful that you have some kind of process in which to work through, a framework in which to work through. So I think it's just helpful to review that. And then we'll talk about best practice to enhance counseling practice and behavioral health practice with LGBTQI youth, considering the current political and legislative climate. Okay, so just scrolling along here, and you'll forgive me, I use PDFs. I don't really like PowerPoints. I think that there's just too much, the possibility of error is far too high. So I find that just using a nice, well-made PDF in this way is just as effective. And I'll make the PDF available when I submit this to the folks who are managing the presentations. So this is kind of what the 2023 map looks like for the legislative year on state proposed youth healthcare bans. Now, and this, I start us here because this is really where integrated healthcare kind of gets most impacted. And so the ACLU, which says these are bills that target access to medically necessary health care, like Medicaid for transgender people. Many of these bills ban affirming care for trans youth. They can create criminal penalties for those who provide the care. That includes primary care providers. Let's see, these bills exempt identical treatments offered for cisgender youth or are forced onto intersex youth. Other bills block funding to medical centers that offer gender affirming care or block insurance coverage for healthcare for transgender people. So you see that this legislation is pretty sweeping. And as you can see there, our purple are the different shades of purple are just the degree into which how many of how many bills have been proposed. So our deep purples have the most bills proposed, and then of course getting lighter, you see fewer bills are proposed, but still a good broad swath of the United States have proposed anti-LGBT or anti-trans youth healthcare bans. And so it's and considering from an integrated healthcare perspective, when we're working with primary care, those are the predominantly the fields that are impacted. And then we as behavioral healthcare professionals struggle to be able to refer. And we'll talk about what treatment protocols are appropriate just kind of briefly for trans youth. But the major thing is that we work in tandem with primary care providers. So let's say, for instance, we're working with a trans youth person who is endorsing a trans identity, who's underage, under 18 in most places, and they need to be referred to a practitioner, a primary care health provider, who can say prescribe hormone replacement or hormone affirming therapy. And in some of these states where it is being proposed, that can happen. And then for us as behavioral health professionals, that's a big part of the treatment protocol for working with in gender affirming care, and that we need to be able to collaborate. And you're seeing here that it's being impacted and potentially quite broadly. So moving along here, another area that is important, I think, for us to identify here are the anti-LGBTQ school policies. And as you can see, there's more deep purple here. There's some other more lilac colors. But still, a big part of the United States is looking at impacting LGBTQIA youth. And we know that behavioral health care professionals work in the school settings, not only as school counselors, but we see a lot of districts now have behavioral health care like LPCs, LCSWs in the schools, and serving in a mental health role outside of, say, specifically a school counseling or school social worker role. And so, these laws are these proposed legislation are going to impact the ability, again, to provide the support that is needed for these young people. And then also from an integrated healthcare perspective, a lot of times we refer, if you're in the schools and you're referring out, and it's going to really impact your ability to do that. ACLU says that state lawmakers are trying to prevent trans students from participating in school activities like sports, force teachers to out students, and censor any in-school discussion of LGBTQ people and issues. And that includes historical representation of LGBTQ people, any kind of sexual health or healthcare related items and topics related to LGBTQ identity. And also instead of limiting resources, education, and opportunities, our schools should protect and support all students to learn and thrive. Is kind of what the ACLU's perspective is and position is on that. And I think the ACLU, the reason I've quoted them here is because they are among the people who pay attention to this at a pretty microscopic level. And so I think, it tells us right there but just between the two of the things I've showed you, and there are certainly other proposed legislations and laws that are being enacted that are impacting the LGBTQIA community, but these two really specifically are having implications for behavioral health care and integrated healthcare professionals because of both the broadness of their potential laws and effects. And then also, as we see, the states are borrowing, kind of templates for laws that have already passed. Okay. And so just as a kind of a quick, discussion about what is, kind of what legislation has looked like. And these are this is legislation from the 2022 year, because again, we are early in the legislative year for 23. I do think it's kind of interesting to see what has already happened. So in Arizona, we see AZSB 1138 was proposed to prohibit physicians from performing gender-affirming surgery on minors and to prohibit physicians from prescribing and administering substances for the purpose of attempting to alter the appearance of or affirm a minor's perception of their gender. And this is words, these are their words. I don't love that gendered language there, but if that appearance or perception is inconsistent with the minor's biological sex. So again, we see that Arizona has proposed legislation to impact primary care, because a lot of times primary care providers and specialists are involved in this role and in helping with gender-affirming care. Kansas, we saw it making it a crime for a doctor to perform gender-affirming surgery or provide hormone replacement therapy for minors. This was vetoed. It did fail in their state legislature. But as you can see, as we scroll back up here, Kansas is it's a new day and it's a new legislative year. So the likelihood of them reintroducing that law back in for possible legislation is very likely. And let's see, in South Carolina, we did see the SC S1259, a gender reassignment amend to the South Carolina Code of Laws. So basically, essentially, it says it prohibits physicians from performing gender reassignment surgery on minors. And reassignment, that's actually not the language we use. We use gender affirming care because we're attempting to affirm a person's gender, and to prohibit physicians from prescribing or administering hormone replacement therapy for young people. And so again, as you can see, these are just 3 laws that were from the previous legislative year, but they're pretty widespread, and they impact us as behavioral healthcare professionals in a major way, because we work in tandem with healthcare primary care, right? And so if it's illegal for primary care to provide the appropriate services for trans and gender expansive youth, that really makes it difficult for us, right, as behavioral healthcare professionals, as we'll see. So the basic anatomy, and this is very reductive, I realize, but essentially it's kind of, you can see it when it comes to LGBTQI youth anti-LGBTQI youth legislation, you really kind of see it in 3 kind of I don't know how we would call it, 3 idioms, right? Again, it's reductive. There's far more nuance to it than what I'm offering you here today. But essentially, we see, of course, trans youth athletics participation. We see school policy legislation and trans youth health regulation. And really, they're trying to outlaw it in many ways. And so those are kind of the 3 things that, and 2 of those specifically, school policy and health regulation, school counselors, behavioral health professionals, integrated healthcare professionals are directly impacted. Okay, and that creates an extraordinarily complex situation for us. I'll give you a little bit about what happened here in Texas last year to give you a sense of what the climate in Texas is right now. There was a letter penned by the governor, or coming out of the governor's office, that essentially says the Texas law imposes reporting requirements upon all licensed professionals who have direct contact with children. These may be who may be subject to abuse, including doctors, nurses, teachers, and behavioral health care professionals are considered mandated reporters. And I'm not going to read the letter because it's just, I don't really think that's appropriate necessarily here. And you're welcome to look it up. It's in my citations if you're really interested in reading the non-binding opinion is what it's called from the Attorney General's office, the state attorney's office, excuse me. And essentially, though, it is saying as a mandated reporting, those of us who have that role, and anyone who's in behavioral health, really, I think it's pretty fair to say, has a mandated reporting requirement by the state of Texas. If you are made aware that a young person is undergoing gender-affirming care, you must report that as child abuse. Okay, and that creates an extremely complicated clinical situation and ethical dilemma for us as professionals, because we are if gender-affirming care, as we will learn, is appropriate and is in accordance with what is prescribed as far as a treatment protocol for working with gender-expansive youth and trans youth, yet we have to report it if it is considered child abuse, right? And so now we'll talk a little bit about where that currently stands right now. But Dr. Mooney's tightrope, Dr. Mooney is a psychologist out of Texas who filed suit against the governor's office and said that they were granted a temporary injunction against Governor Abbott's order to investigate all cases of gender-affirming care as trans youth as child abuse, because Dr. Mooney found themselves in a pretty sticky spot because they were working with a trans youth and their family, and the court, the district court ruled, and I'm going to read this quote. It's a little weird, but I'll break it apart as we go. But it says that in the opinion of Judge Meacham, the court finds Jane Doe has been placed on administrative leave at work and is at risk of losing her job, and that Jane, John, and Mary Doe face imminent and ongoing deprivation of their constitutional rights and potential loss of necessary medical care and the stigma attached to being subject of an unfound child abuse investigation. Jane, John, and Mary Doe are the family of the clients that are of Dr. Mooney. Further, the courts find that if placed on the child abuse registry, Jane Doe could lose the ability to practice her profession, and both Jane and John Doe could lose their ability to work with minors and volunteer in the community. And again, those are folks named in this suit. So it was found. I mean, this was pretty quickly after the fact. And now currently this guidance from the governor's office is a non-binding opinion, which means it's not law. The governor cannot create law. The state legislature does that, but they can guide the offices and inform policy. And so this it's been suspended, right? And so we don't know, and at any point it could be reenacted. And so really what has happened is the court has said that the state cannot investigate these particular issues as child abuse, but we are still required on some level as mandated reporters, technically based on the guidance, to report it when we suspect it as child abuse. So again, just because you're not investigating it does not mean that we don't have the responsibility to report it. And we'll talk about what that looks like is as far as like what the ethics look like that behind that in brief later on. In Florida, we saw the Don't Say Gay bill, or also known as the Parental Rights and Education Act. Essentially, this prohibits the discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity from kindergarten to third grade. Further, and this is the piece that might impact school-based mental health professionals, further forbids schools from prohibiting parental access to school and health records, which means if you are working with a transgender or gender-expansive youth or an LGBTQI youth in general, and you document the conversations you're having, which we all maintain clinical documentation of some kind, the parents have the right to access that. And now it's my understanding they've always had the right to access that, but it's sort of a point to be made that as they've put the two together with sexual orientation and gender identity. So essentially this forces school-based mental health professionals to out the child to the parent even when it may not be safe. So again, and this is law right now in Florida, and we're seeing a lot of states kind of use this as a template for their own state. Possible legislation in their own state. And so again, it really begs that question, kind of how do you navigate, how do you practice as a mental health professional in these kind of what I call tightropes. These are, we're walking a very thin line here. The school counselor's tightrope, or the school-based mental health professional's tightrope, would be the Florida bill requires school counselors to notify parents regarding mental health care they receive. This includes any queer and transgender identity exploration that may occur. Okay, and what other implications emerge because of this? I mean, there's a lot of different things to consider in terms of confidentiality, in terms of if the child is endorsing a transgender gender identity outside of what the parents would prefer, and all these things. And so again, you start to see kind of these ethical murky situations, these tightropes you have to walk to ensure that you're providing the best care to your clients and to your patients while trying to be in accordance with the law. And what we'll find here is that the guidance from the American Counseling Association or other behavioral healthcare professions associations is not in line with the state law. okay, on this particular issue or on these particular issues. And so it again creates a very tight rope. So Arkansas was an interesting case. We see in 2021, the first law of its kind, it banned gender affirming care for trans youth, just outright, flat out, passed the law and everything. And what's very interesting is that in this state, it was originally vetoed by the governor of Arkansas. And this veto was overturned by the state legislature, which means it takes a 2/3 majority to overturn a veto from the governor's office. And this does not outlaw mental health care, as noted by the Attorney General, Lisa Rutledge, but it does outlaw primary care or gender affirming health care. And again, as we've stated, a big part of providing gender affirming health care for trans and gender expansive youth is the inclusion and the working with primary care providers. Alabama has since adopted a similar law, making it a felony up to 10 years in prison for primary care providers who are providing gender affirming care. Okay, so you can go to jail for up to 10 years in Alabama. October, ACLU has filed suit against Arkansas, and the case is currently being argued in court. And to my knowledge, it's still being argued. I need to look up the status of that case particularly. But so this provides a very tight rope for counselors and behavioral health care professionals to walk in general. WPATH, which is kind of the, the guiding organization that provides consultation and guidance for working with transgender health, both in behavioral health care and integrated health and primary care, we see that it suggests that gender affirming care includes physical and mental health care among other allied healthcare professionals. So what that means is that to provide the most holistic care, you have to have the whole team together, right? And with these laws that we saw in Arkansas and Alabama, and that are being proposed in other states, alongside the mandatory reporting restrictions that we're seeing and all of these other things, is becoming quite difficult to do that. When WPATH, again, which is among the guiding organizations that provide us providers with guidance to help provide to support these clients and patients in healthcare settings, they're saying we need both, and the research as well supports that. Will there be an increased restriction on mental health practice of working with gender affirming care? So currently there is not. There is no state law that I have come across now, and this, again, it's a rapidly evolving situation, so I could be wrong as I say this, but there's currently no one banning mental health care. Okay, but again, if we're thinking from that integrated healthcare lens, we can't have integrated healthcare without both behavioral healthcare and primary care, right? And so, it severely impacts the ways in which we're able to provide the care. Additionally, if we see them success in restricting primary care, where does it go for mental health care, right? And so, it really just begs that question. So what are the ethical implications? Well, these are a couple of the ones that I have kind of identified, and you very well might have other ones. And I encourage you to be just dialoguing about this with your colleagues and your professors and classmates and things, and really thinking about what ethical implications may emerge because of this very rapidly evolving situation. First of all, it impacts confidentiality of queer and trans youth identities in schools. I mean, youth spend majority of their daytime, majority of their year in school, right? And as school-based mental health professionals, school counselors, and other school healthcare providers, this impacts the ability for confidentiality. I mean, which can be a safety issue for many youth. If they're members of an unaffirming family or something like that. So again, it creates these tightrope for us to walk. It forces us to practice inconsistent with professional and scientific standards. As we've mentioned, the WPATH has said, you need both primary care and behavioral health care. And they're well-cited, documented, well-researched organization that suggests that this is the laws are asking us to practice inconsistent with the research, when the ethics of our professions generally say, if not always say, you need to practice with the scientific and evidence base that you have that supports the work. Additionally, it creates ethical implications for mandated reporting. right? And so in states where we are, like for instance, in Texas, we're currently being, there was the guidance from the governor's office to report cases of gender affirming care for underage gender expansive youth as child abuse, right? And so it really, again, it creates a very complex situation. And you need to be very familiar with the definition of child abuse in the state that you're working in. You need to know what the reporting procedures are. What is the current status of that legislation or guidance? And what ways are we beholden to that? To remain ethical and in good standing with our licensing boards. And it creates almost an impossible scenario in which we can provide LGBTQI affirming care. Because as integrated healthcare professionals, part of that affirming care is both access to primary and behavioral health care, right? And so if we only have half of that, we're only doing 50% of the job. And so it becomes extraordinarily difficult to provide the holistic care that integrated healthcare is really about in the first place, right? I mean, integrated care is about bringing together behavioral and primary care and treating the whole client, treating the whole patient, right? The head is attached to the body is kind of what we used to say in the clinic. And so we're not just doing, one thing and then the other. We're trying to work with the whole person. And that becomes extremely difficult to do when legislation and law is outlining and impacting our ability to provide that care, particularly when it's consistent with professional standards and best care. But fear not, because there are major mental health organizations and what we call child welfare stakeholders who remains committed to supporting transgender health care and access to that and our ability to practice in that it's in that way that it's consistent with best practice and standard of care. And I'm not going to read all of these, but you'll see, you likely will see, depending on what profession you come from, you may very well see your profession there represented. As I'm a member of the American Counseling Association, you'll see my somewhere in there, right there, ACA, American Counseling Association, for our friends, the social workers, our school psychology friends. The psychology friends, our OBGYN friends, pediatricians, psychiatrists. I mean, they're all on board with saying that, these types of things can impact our ability to practice, and it is inconsistent with the research and professional standard of practice. So just know that there are powerful lobbying groups out there who are working on our behalf. But at the same time, the lobbying takes time. And we are, as professionals, we have to be able to move very agilely through this. And so understanding what the current legislative climate is and how that's impacting your ability to provide integrative care is important. But know that, and you can turn to these organizations. They do a very nice job of curating best practices and how to maneuver through those situations. And oftentimes, if you are a member of these organizations and you have ethical questions that you need to consult with an attorney, I can tell you that I know for sure, like for instance, the Texas Counseling Association has a really great resource for that. If I need to practice, if I have a question about ethical practice, I can consult with an attorney as a fee-paying member of the organization, which is a very useful thing because I don't always have a retainer or an attorney on retainer. Okay, so turning to the ethical decision-making. So one of the things that, I kind of want to wrap this up with is really thinking about how do you maneuver through these situations? If you have a client who walks into your office who is, who identifies as transgender or gender expansive or gender nonconforming or in those areas, and they're underage, and their parents are not affirming, how do you maneuver through that? How do you keep the best interest of the client at heart or the patient at heart? So I offer these ethical decision-making models. And this again comes from the counseling profession, that there are similar ethical decision-making models from the literature that supports your profession. And they all tend to kind of look very similar. And it really doesn't matter which ethical decision-making model you use so much as you are using one. Okay, one of the things I teach in my ethics class is about how, if I have to sit in front of the licensing board and defend my decision, whatever it was, I want to be able to do it in a way that is organized, that has got a framework behind it, that's a generally accepted practice in the field, and all these other things. And so, in using this decision-making model and sitting in front of the board and walking them through each of the steps that I took to make that decision from an ethical perspective, well, really, it's harder to argue with that. Okay, particularly because it has such a very nice organized framework. Additionally, if you're anything like me, these issues are quite important to me both from a personal and a professional perspective. And when I start to get upset or frustrated about the current climate, but I need a way to act, I need a way to know how to articulate myself professionally. These kinds of models are very helpful to get me back on there, as opposed to saying what I want to say, which may have a lot of swear words, and that's not really helpful, and that's not really professional, and that's also not always productive. And so as a professional in this setting or in this area, I want to lean on my tools. And one of the tools we have is these ethical decision-making models. So again, I chose the Forrester Miller Davis model because it's pretty common, for any person who's trained in clinical mental health or is a member of the ACA. You've seen this in some form or fashion. I've kind of used my own font and kind of hybridized it for our discussion today, but so these are the steps, and I'm not going to belabor it, but I'm going to kind of walk you through it, just one scenario and where it might be important to do that. Identify the problem, apply the ACA code of ethics, and the other side of it too is that what we in the counseling profession, we have LGBTQI standards of care that are written out, very well articulated documents. And my sense is that if you are from another allied health profession, your organization has something similar. And so it's really helpful because it gives you the language to support your decision making, and to as well, it gives you a place to start. So we'll talk a little bit about the SAGE counseling competencies, which are the queer and transgender counseling competencies that we use in the counseling profession. You determine the nature and dimension of the dilemma, you generate a potential course of action, you look at the consequences of all the options and determine a course of action. Evaluate the selected course of action, implement the course of action, okay? And so it gets very breaks it down for us. So here's just kind of a brief ethical case example, and they're never this simple, they're never this clear, or necessarily, and usually have a lot more detail. But just to give us a sense of how to use a decision-making model, ethical decision-making model. You said, let's pretend you're a professional counselor in Texas, contacted by a mother of a 14-year-old child. The mother has identified that her child seems depressed and struggling with academic performance. After a few sessions, you've identified that the client is endorsing a gender-expansive identity, meaning they may be exploring transgender identity or other gender non-binary identities. It has become clear that gender-affirming care may be appropriate for the young client. Considering Governor Abbott's direction about treating gender-affirming care, or as noted in the governor's letter, sex change as possible quote, child abuse, and those are their words, not mine, what are the ethical implications that arise here? And how might you advise the family in supporting their gender-expansive child in gender-affirming care, right? So that, again, 14-year-old child who may be endorsing a transgender identity, and how do we, under the guidance from the governor's office, work through that? So let's take it to the decision-making model, okay? This is just another slide with the same ethical decision-making model, but let's break this down. So let's identify the problem. Well, if we were live, I would ask, we explore this and kind of try to get all the decision-making model, or excuse me, all of the problems identified in this particular case. But these are, for brevity's sake, these are kind of some of the problems that I kind of found just off the top of my head. Gender-affirming care is appropriate for this young person, right? And how is that a problem? Well, we can't provide it, right? As we've established. And we need to get physical healthcare providers, primary care providers involved. And they're appropriate in this situation with gender-expansive youth seeking gender-affirming counseling. So we would need to make a referral, right? We would have our network of trans and gender-expansive knowledgeable primary care providers, and this client would need to be referred to them for possible evaluation and assessment and gender-affirming intervention. So what else, right? So just off the top of our head, we can't, those two things are already impacted. And there's a bunch of other things, mandatory reporting, inconsistent with the standard of practice by our profession. right? I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that we can identify as the problem, but those are kind of the two primary ones that just off the top of my head. Well, step 2 is to apply the ACA code and the SAGE competencies. Well, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I've highlighted kind of some of the areas that I think are really helpful to know. The first one is respect the dignity and promote the welfare of the client. We got to promote the welfare of the client, number one. I mean, it's right there, A1.A, right? I mean, it can't get more number one than that. When it comes to our code of ethics in the counseling profession. And my sense is that if you are from another counseling profession, or excuse me, behavioral health profession, there's a similar quote in your code of ethics, right? When we look at advocacy, we advocate at individual, group, institutional, and societal levels to address potential barriers and obstacles that inhibit access, growth, and development of clients, right? So there's an advocacy piece for us in this piece as well, or in this case as well, right? We look at the non-discrimination piece. We do not condone or engage in discrimination. Okay, and in some ways, we see here, if you look down, we look at gender and gender identity, sexual orientation, are all three identified areas where we avoid discrimination in our clients or in our patients. Okay, and those are protected classes. So ACA Code of Ethics goes on to say we practice that it's grounded in theory and an empirical or scientific foundation, right? And again, my sense is, as we saw in the previous slide, that social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses, school psychologists, everybody else has a very similar requirement of their ethics as well. Additionally, we look at conflicts between the ethics and laws. If ethical responsibility conflicts with law, regulation, or governing legal authority, counselors make it known their commitment to the ACA Code of Ethics and take steps to resolve the conflict. And we act in the best interest of the client and may adhere to requirements of the law and or governing legal authority. Okay, but remember, we're always promoting the welfare of the client. So we're just revisiting these ACA Code of Ethics, and I encourage you to do that as well. I threw this in here because I think it's really helpful for school-based mental health professionals and school counselors. School counselors have a primary obligation to the student, who are to be treated with dignity and respect as unique individuals. They foster and affirm all students and their identity for psychosocial development, and provide a culturally responsive instruction and appraisal and advisement to students, right? And so we respect the family's values and beliefs and cultural background, as well as student sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And we exercise great care to avoid imposing our personal bias, belief, or values. As well, we advocate for equitable, anti-oppressive, anti-bias policies and procedures. And so there's some guidance there. Okay, while we respect, we also respect the family, we also respect the child's identities. Okay, so we get into the SAGE counseling competencies. If I haven't pushed this agenda enough, in terms of returning to your guiding documents, your standards of practice, SAGE, which stands for the Society for Affectional, Intersex, and Gender Expansive Issues in Counseling, and this is essentially it's the queer and transgender counseling organization under the ACA as a division of ACA. They say in their transgender counseling competency, they say that we affirm transgender mental health care and medical health care. See, those are two together. That is the definition of transgender affirming integrative health care. Okay, mental and medical, primary or behavioral, whatever language you want to use, it's there. Okay, we understand that trans prejudice and transphobia pervade the social and cultural foundations of many institutions and traditions. As you remember the state's map, how much of that was purple, right? And so we recognize that this is part of the deal. It's inside, and it's in this prejudice and phobia fosters negative attitudes and high incidence of hostility and violence and crime against transgender people and gender expansive people. I'll look at my font here. I don't know how I changed the font there. We use empowerment advocacy interventions. For the ACA, we have competencies and ACA advocacy best practices. When necessary and at the request of the transgender client. We acknowledge and address gatekeeping roles and subsequent power and mental health professionals and the historical concerns that have arisen from that. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. My neighbors were mowing their lawn. Okay, anyhow, so returning this, so we use the knowledge that we recognize that as behavioral healthcare professionals, there's a gatekeeping role that we maintain, and that we recognize that it's part of the institutional barriers that occur as trans people and gender expansive people access healthcare. Okay, so moving along here, we determine the nature and dimensions of the ethical dilemma, and we recognize that the non-binding opinion is called sex change, which is defined as there, and we understand that the nature of the dilemma can also recommends that WPATH suggests the involvement of primary care providers in regards to medical transitioning. And so we recognize that to be consistent with our standard of care, that we include medical and primary care as part of the treatment protocol treatment team, right? Despite the fact of what we see here outlined in the non-binding opinion. Okay, the counselor affirms the identity of trans and gender affirming clients, but are limited in their referral possibilities. So that's another nature or dimension of the dilemma, right? And so that's letting us know, that's one of the limitations. So, okay, what else? Well, I think that's definitely something to dialogue about. What else might be in terms of the nature of the dilemma? So, okay. As we go along, we now generate a potential course of action. So we encourage and explore exploring the benefits of social transitioning. So one of the things we know is that we have a good sense of what transgender healthcare looks like. And from the behavioral health side, there's a continuum of transitioning, all the way from what primary care would get involved with in terms of medical transitioning to social transitioning, which is changing the social appearance, name, dress, behaviors, things like that. So that's one thing that we can explore, because we do know that research lets us know that social transitioning for gender expansive youth indicates positive mental health outcomes. Okay. Another potential course of action is we consider the non-binding opinion states genital surgery should not be carried out until a patient is of legal age of majority to give consent, which is 18 years old in the state of Texas. So we might encourage delaying medical transitioning while engaging with social transitioning, right? So we encourage the client, the underage client, to wait until they're 18 to make the decision for themselves. We advise the parents that currently medical intervention should be construed or is construed as child abuse, and that the role of the mandated reporters for behavioral health care professionals. So we let them know, listen, this is what, informed consent. Okay. And I'm informing you that this is a possibility. Okay. And that this is currently the guidance based on what I have to, how I have to practice. So that's, again, those are potential courses of action. So then we say, well, okay, let's consider the potential course of action, and let me zoom, like take up the window here, and what we can do as a result, right? And kind of what it says, we consider the potential consequences of all the options and determine the course of action. Well, we mentioned specifically exploring the benefits of social transitioning, and what is the potential, consequence of that? Well, the child and the parent may wish to avoid exploring social transitioning and wish to pursue other modes of transitioning, legal transitioning, medical transitioning, etc. So that's something that could occur as a result. Consider the non-binding opinion states that genital surgery should not be carried out until the patient is 18, and they encourage them to delay making that decision until they're 18. The parent and the child may decline to wait until they're 18. Right, that's another potential consequence of our course of action. And then we can say, advise the parent that currently medical transitioning can be construed as child abuse, and the role of the mandated report for LPCs. The parent and child may disclose they are pursuing medical transition anyway, knowing that that's the case. Okay, and so those are potential courses of action that could and what the consequences might be. Well, then we evaluate and select a course of action. We ensure that the informed consent and the limitations of our role as a mandated reporter and provider of gender affirming counseling to the gender expansive youth as currently providing the service does not appear to be constituted as child abuse under the current non-binding opinion. So we inform them. What we're doing in here is behavioral health is not impacted necessarily by the non-binding opinion that's impacting medical care. Okay. Further, we practice in accordance with the counseling competencies in the ACA Code of Ethics. So we're advocating. We are, we're discussing, we're exploring, we're staying informed, and making sure that we are aware of how this is this evolving situation. And then, so then, how do we, we implement the course of action, and maybe we let them know, hey, this is kind of how things stand. and then this is how we can support you. And then of course, you make the conversation with the client, and the client makes a decision based on what you have provided them ethically. So, if there's any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me. That kind of concludes using the ethical decision-making model. And again, this is an evolving situation. And so there's no real specific recommendation, but instead it's about knowing your resources, knowing where to turn when you have these ethical questions or that are impacting our ability to practice and provide care for LGBTQIA youth, and how to navigate those. So again, a couple of things: ethical decision-making model, your competencies and standards of care for your professions, and then also being aware of what is going on in the legislative climate and how that's going to impact your work. So staying attuned to those things with your counseling organizations, with other organizations that may be monitoring these situations. So again, you can reach out to me, insmith@sbu.edu, if you'd like to continue the conversation. I really appreciate you tuning in today, and thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you around if you have any questions. Take care.